Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something that used to feel, well, firmly in the realm of science fiction. Human genetic engineering.
Right, something for maybe decades down the line.
Exactly. But the thing is, and this is what we're diving into today, it's not someday anymore. This whole complex, ethically loaded topic, it's here, right now.
The conversation is definitely happening now, yes.
You probably remember 2018, big news, that Chinese scientist, He Jiankui, editing the genes of twin baby girls.
Oh, yeah. The reaction was immediate and pretty much universally negative, at least from the scientific community.
Totally. Scientists called it reckless. Ethicists were obviously deeply concerned. Governments scrambled to tighten bans. He Jiankui even ended up in prison.
And that just cast this huge shadow, didn't it?
Yeah.
Embryo editing became almost, like, untouchable.
For sure. Research funding just seemed to vanish, and nobody really wanted to talk about it publicly. It just stopped. But now, something's changing. That's what we want to explore. Why is this topic, the one everyone shied away from, suddenly back? And why do we need to talk about it honestly now? Because it's not abstract anymore.
It's becoming very concrete, very quickly.
So, okay, let's unpack this then. What's different? Why is this conversation coming back into the light?
Well, I think one of the biggest factors, honestly, is a pretty major shift in public opinion. It's quite striking.
Oh, interesting. How so?
There was a recent Pew survey, and it found, get this, 72% of Americans now actually support editing a baby's genes, specifically to treat a serious condition they're born with.
72%. Wow, that's high.
It is, and it doesn't stop there. Around 60% also support doing it to cut the risk of serious diseases cropping up later in life.
Okay.
But, and this is really key, only about 19% are okay with using it for, like, enhancement, making a baby smarter, say.
Right, so there's a very clear line people are drawing.
Exactly. Treating disease, yes. Trying to enhance traits, generally no. That public acceptance, even just for the medical side, that's creating space for the conversation again. It gives a kind of social license, you know?
That makes sense. A huge shift from the backlash in 2018. But does that public support, I wonder, does it create its own pressures? Like, could it rush things or blur that line between treatment and enhancement if we're not careful?
That's a really sharp point. It's definitely a double-edged sword.
Huh.
Public support is crucial, obviously, for getting research funded, for maybe changing policies down the road. It gives it momentum.
Sure.
But yeah, the nuances can easily get lost in the public discussion. That line between fixing a disease and trying to improve someone, it can get fuzzy if scientists and ethicists aren't super clear and careful on how they talk about it.
So it's a positive driver, but needs careful handling.
Absolutely. It puts a bigger responsibility on everyone involved to be transparent and define those boundaries. And look, it's not just public opinion. The actual science, the tools themselves, they've advanced incredibly since 2018. That's the other huge piece of this.
Okay, tell me about that, because advanced incredibly sounds like a big deal, especially given the worries about the early tech.
It really is. To think back to the early days, like with CRISPR, around the time of the He Jiankui incident, researchers sometimes called those tools a bit, well, clunky.
Clunky, okay. In what way?
Well, you could get off-target effects, so edits happening in the wrong place in the genome, or something called mosaicism.
Mosaicism.
Yeah, where different cells in the embryo end up with different edits, or some cells get edited and others don't. It wasn't perfectly consistent. And sometimes you can even lose big chunks of DNA. Not ideal, obviously.
No, definitely not. So what's new?
So now we have newer tools like base editing and prime editing. These are much, much more precise. Instead of cutting the DNA double strand, which is kind of how CRISPR works primarily, these newer methods can change just a single DNA letter, a base, without making that big break.
Ah, like fixing a typo instead of ripping out the page.
That's a great analogy, actually. It's a much smoother, more controlled process. And scientists are using these now, successfully, in human embryos in the lab.
In the lab, okay. So not for pregnancies yet.
Right. Very important distinction. It's illegal to implant these edited embryos for pregnancy in most places, including the U.S. But the lab work itself is showing the technology is getting way safer and more predictable.
That precision sounds like a game changer. But even with, fixing typos instead of ripping pages, are there still risks? Long-term effects we just don't know about? What's the biggest hurdle left before this could even be considered for actual clinical use?
Yeah, you've nailed the central issue. Precision is way up, but the biggest hurdle is still ensuring, like, absolute safety across every single cell and understanding what happens decades down the line.
Because these are permanent changes, potentially passed on.
Exactly. Germline changes. The stakes are incredibly high. So the bar for safety has to be astronomical. Mosaicism is still a challenge, too. Making sure every cell gets the intended edit perfectly is still tough. So yeah, the tech is exciting, but the scientific community is still moving very, very cautiously. Rigorous testing is paramount. It's where the science really meets the ethical weight.
Okay, so science is moving, public opinion is shifting, but then you mentioned another piece, something maybe less expected. Big tech, venture capital.
Yes, exactly. This is quite new and pretty significant. Recently, Brian Armstrong, he's the CEO of Coinbase, the cryptocurrency exchange, he basically put out a public call.
For what?
He said he wants to fund a U.S. startup focused specifically on embryo editing. He's looking for scientists, engineers. He called it building the defining company in this space.
Wow. Focusing on what aspect?
Clearly focused on treating genetic diseases. He even offered to fly interested people out to the Bay Area for dinner to talk about it.
Okay, that's more than just casual interest. That's putting money and effort behind it.
Definitely. And the timing is so telling, isn't it? When venture capital like that starts showing serious interest, it means they see the science as becoming genuinely viable, maybe even commercially viable down the line. And they likely sense that public acceptance for the medical uses is growing.
Right. The money follows the potential.
Precisely. But it also highlights the legal situation. As we said, right now, the FDA in the U.S. can't even look at an application to edit embryos for pregnancy. It's legally barred.
So how does Armstrong's interest square with that?
Well, that's the insight, right? Laws aren't static. When you have growing public support for medical use, plus serious investors ready to fund it, it starts to put pressure on those legal barriers. It suggests a challenge to those laws might be coming. This isn't just academic anymore.
So what does all this mean for us right now? It feels like we've jumped from debating a hypothetical future to suddenly needing to grapple with real proposals, real possibilities.
That's exactly it. We're past the abstract stage. And this shift is prompting new ways of engaging. For instance, there's a group that's emerged calling themselves the Manhattan Project. A deliberately provocative name, I think.
The Manhattan Project, what are they about?
Their whole approach is interesting because they're trying to get ahead of the ethical concerns.
Yeah.
Instead of just reacting, they're pushing for what they call radical transparency. They want to build trust by focusing strictly on medical applications, tackling those slippery slope fears directly.
And their mission
Is bold. They talk about building a future where no child inherits a preventable genetic disease, using safe, ethical gene correction. Their core idea is that these inherited conditions, they shouldn't just be accepted as fate. Innovation with the right ethical framework can change that.
How are they proposing to do that?
They're focused on precision gene correction, right at the embryo level, dealing with the disease at the source before it takes hold and potentially preventing it from being passed down.
So germline editing, the kind that gets inherited.
Yes, germline gene correction. That's the key, and why it's so powerful and, yes, controversial. They stress doing it all in the U.S. under strict regulation, guided by ethics. Importantly, they don't support a permanent global ban on this.
They think it can be done responsibly.
They believe it can if it's done carefully, openly, ethically, specifically to stop suffering. They keep repeating, no secrecy, no shortcuts, no overpromises. They list specific diseases they're aiming at, things like Alzheimer's, sickle cell Huntington's, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, really devastating conditions.
Okay, so that brings us right to the heart of the ethical debate, doesn't it? It sounds like there are two main camps forming.
Yeah, broadly speaking. On one side, you've got what you might call the cautiously optimistic view. These are researchers who see a path forward, maybe, for safely editing an embryo to prevent something like Tay-Sachs or cystic fibrosis, especially with strong oversight.
Especially for parents who don't have other good options.
Exactly. Like if both parents carry the gene, and maybe standard PGT pre-implantation genetic testing where they screen embryos isn't enough or isn't viable for them. The focus here is purely on preventing terrible suffering.
Then the other side.
That's the more hesitant view.
Yeah.
And it usually comes back to that slippery slope argument we mentioned.
Right, the feel that once you start, you can't stop.
Precisely. The worry is, even if you start with the absolute best intentions, just treating diseases, you're building the infrastructure, the technology, how long before someone tries to use it for enhancement, making kids taller, smarter, whatever?
And if that happens, who gets access?
That's the huge concern. If only the wealthy can afford these enhancements, you could deepen social divides massively. You could create a kind of genetic upper class. It's a serious worry about fairness and equality.
That slippery slope argument is really potent. It taps into deep anxieties people have. Is there any kind of middle ground emerging, or are people just digging into these two positions? How do you balance the potential good against those risks?
That's really the crux of it now. And yes, I think a middle ground is what many scientists are pushing for, a very careful, step-by-step approach.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning, keep the research going, but strictly in the lab for now. Focus intensely on proving safety, beyond any doubt. Build public trust through absolute transparency. And this is critical work together globally to set really clear, enforceable rules about what's allowed and what isn't.
So not a ban, but very tight guardrails.
Exactly. The conversation for many isn't whether to explore it, but how to do it responsibly. Slow, deliberate progress. Constant public dialogue that seems to be the most favored path for navigating this.
You know, what strikes me most about all this, listening to you, is how the conversation itself seems to have changed. It feels more out in the open now, less behind closed doors.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that might be one of the most important shifts. For the first time in ages, these critical discussions are happening publicly, not just in academic circles or policy meetings.
You mean like online, in journals?
Yeah, online, experts writing threads, debating openly. It's happening out loud. And that transparency, that public back and forth, it's so vital. It brings in more viewpoints, forces everyone to confront the implications together rather than having decisions made quietly.
So let's just circle back. What this really boils down to, at least for now, isn't some sci-fi scenario of designer babies.
No, not in the immediate practical sense.
It's about potentially helping actual people, parents facing devastating genetic odds who want healthy kids and just don't have other ways.
That's the core motivation driving the therapeutic side, yes. Look, it's incredibly complex. It's deeply personal for families affected. And technologically, it's still early days, despite the advances.
But things are moving.
Undeniably, the ground is shifting. Public opinion, at least for medicine, is warming up. The science is getting better, faster. And now, investors are circling. The conversation about using gene editing to prevent disease, it is definitely back on the table. It demands our attention.
So thinking about all this, what responsibility do you, listening right now, think we have as a society? Now that this isn't hypothetical anymore, how do we steer this incredibly powerful technology? How do we make sure it genuinely helps those suffering and helps all of them, not just a select few? And how do we put up the right fences to avoid that slippery slope everyone's worried about? That's the question we really need to engage with now.